For more now on Reverend Billy Graham, we want to bring in from Washington, Washington Post political reporter Eugene Scott. So, Eugene, you've been following the latest on Graham. There's been sort of a lot of mixed reaction to Graham's legacy. What are you hearing? What can you tell us?
Indeed, Graham was praised for perhaps being the last bipartisan presidential advisor from the faith community, should I say. He had positive relationships with the Clintons and President Obama, as well as the Bushes and President Nixon. But the reality is there's been some criticism because Graham has been perhaps a forefather of what is the modern evangelical movement and community. And it is a group of Americans who in some circles are perhaps known far more for their politics and partisanship than for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we have seen that in terms of how this community has rallied behind the Trump administration and gone on to affirm or at least excuse or ignore or not address issues that past evangelical leaders would have found problematic, such as the president's calling Americans protesting racism, profane names, the scandals with porn stars allegedly and Playboy mates, and there's just been some real interest in terms of where the next generation of evangelical leaders are going to lead the country when it comes to engaging politics.
Eugene, sorry, I'm just looking at one of your most recent articles that I find pretty interesting. North Carolina wants Billy Graham statue to replace one of a white supremacist at the U.S. Capitol.
Absolutely. As you remember, back from last year with Charlottesville, that brought to national attention a conversation that's been existing for years in some legislatures in the South about memorials honoring white supremacists and white nationalists. And quite frankly, both of the statues in the U.S. Capitol representing the state of North Carolina honor white nationalists. Aycock was a governor and I believe a senator, but also one who held very racist views. The other, Zebulon Vance, is for a Confederate soldier. So the legislature in North Carolina, supported by North Carolina's representatives in Congress, want the Aycock statue replaced with Billy Graham. And by all accounts, Billy Graham is viewed as a much more inclusive leader than Aycock. However, there is quite some debate about whether or not he was as progressive when it comes to addressing issues of racial reconciliation as some of his supporters claim.
Eugene, you're right, though. Despite his evangelical Christian background, this proposal could face pushback from conservatives who have criticized efforts to remove such statues in rewriting history, and that could include pushback from the president himself. Do you think, however, that will change given the profound impact Billy Graham has had on Christianity and on the nation, and his ties really to a dozen presidents, being their spiritual advisors and never giving them any political advice, merely spiritual advice, never advising them on politics of the day?
I think in general, conservatives will respond well to the idea of Graham replacing the Aycock statue because Graham, as you mentioned, is so beloved by conservative lawmakers. And the real reason, quite frankly, that they want to replace Aycock isn't because of his white supremacist views, at least not from conservatives. Lawmakers just want to honor Billy Graham. He's from North Carolina. He's generally viewed as well-liked, has very high approval ratings. His ranked highly on Times, like most influential people lists for years. And so if they were trying to say we want to replace this statue because we think he's racist, I think he would get more negative pushback. But that's not the main reason that conservatives want it replaced.
Eugene, you mentioned that some of his supporters tout his his input in the civil rights movement, if you will, but there has been pushback about that. We know that he was amongst the earliest public preachers, to refuse to preach to a segregated crowd. We know that he suggested to Eisenhower that that Eisenhower sent troops to Arkansas when they were trying to integrate the Little Rock High School. But so what are critics saying? Because it appears, at least on the surface, that he was in the ear of leadership and was on the right side of history.
In some ways, he was. As you shared, that he integrated his crusades, and Reverend Jesse Jackson, who was a civil rights leader and a politician, praised him for that. He shared his platform with Martin Luther King during a time where many conservative Christians thought Martin Luther King was too much of an outlier in terms of their faith and political views. But Graham has also been on the record saying that there were too many black leaders who wanted too much too fast. He also expressed concern about civil rights leaders and their association with anti-Vietnam protests as well as communist organizations. And so his view of liberals was quite concerning. He also has been on the record via tapes as making some pretty anti-Semitic comments in a conversation with Richard Nixon that he eventually had to apologize for. Other progressives have criticized him for not having gay-affirming views that are, quite frankly, pretty consistent with white evangelical leaders. But it was not an idea that suggested inclusivity. And there are people who don't know if they want to see a statue in the Capitol honoring someone that they felt like perhaps didn't recognize large swaths of Americans.
Eugene, the President and First Lady arrived in Charlotte from Air Force One within the past 10 minutes. And let's turn our attention now to President Trump. You wrote an article yesterday titled, "Nearly half of white Americans think Trump is a racist." So based off of a new poll, what can you tell us?
Well, it's not surprising, given the president's last comments since he launched his campaign, that many black and many Latino, most, in fact, Americans believe that the president is racist or holds racially discriminatory views. What is a bit surprising, though, is that a sizable percentage of white Americans have listened to Trump talk about NFL players, talk about black immigrants, talk about Confederate memorials, talk about immigrants from Mexico and other Latin American countries, and they too believe that the president is racist. And that's surprising because white Americans are one of the demographics that Trump won in the 2016 election. And so the question becomes, what happens when large percentages, and overall it's nearly 60%, large percentages of Americans believe that their president is racist in an increasingly diverse country? What does that mean for the GOP, and what does that mean for Trump's re-election come 2020 after the midterms?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. I wonder if these same people thought he was racist in 2016 when they voted. I mean, the reality of it is that he sort of had a history of questionable public comments, questioning President Obama's legitimacy as a president, questioning where he was born. The Central Park 5 or Central Park 6? 5? Central Park 5, yeah. Demanding that they be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Now we know that they were innocent and weren't involved at all. He's been pretty outspoken when it comes to race and race issues, injecting himself in a way that has been unflattering and in many cases just flat out wrong, but people still voted for him.
Absolutely. I think those are such important points. A lot of Trump supporters try to say that the president was never accused of being racist before he launched his presidential campaign. And as you noted, that's just not true. Even going back to the 1970s, the president was sued by the federal government for discriminating against black people in housing. And so he actually does have a history of doing things and saying things that people find discriminatory. But also, to your point, there were people on the left, white people on the left, black people on the left, brown people on the left, who were trying to convince people that Trump did not have an inclusive view in his vision to make America great again before he won, and he still won. And so the question becomes, what impact could this have? This is not news to large numbers of the electorate. I think what may be a little different is that it appears that there are some people who were not convinced that Trump could be racist prior to his entering the White House who now think he possibly could be.
Okay, I want to ask you one more question before we let you go. We're going to switch gears a little bit, but I have to ask you about, this gun control debate. We saw the president with this open meeting that frankly shocked a lot of people, shocked a lot of Republicans, I'm sure. Yeah, exactly. Where he seemed open to some sort of gun control that would be a consensus between sort of all points of view. He actually sort of admonished Senator Toomey for being afraid of the NRA. And then we find out that he has a dinner with the NRA, and suddenly there are new tweets coming out from Chris Cox from the NRA saying, don't worry, the president does not want gun control. And by the way, he supports due process, which is something that the president seemed to sort of flout a little bit when it came to mental illness. And then the president saying they had a great meeting with the NRA. What are we to make of this? Is this just another example of the last person in the room is the one that influences the president's decision making?
I think that is part of what's happening. And I think what's also happening is, with all due respect to the president, he's not known as someone who has deeply held convictions about policy issues. And we saw this when it came to health care, and we saw this when it came to immigration. And so the reality is perhaps he's not putting forward a clear, consistent vision because he's yet to have one. And he's still trying to form it and listen to all voices that are involved in the conversation to figure out where he stands and where he wants to land when this conversation is over. One thing the president does want to do is win. And he sees that the majority of the American voters, including Republicans, are interested in some degree of gun control. And that's something likely at the forefront of his mind as he heads towards midterms. What he will eventually decide is yet to be determined, but he certainly is looking to Republicans in Congress to come up with a bill that he thinks he can get behind without losing support of the people who sent him to the White House.
And clearly not losing support of the NRA, which I don't think he's going to be able to have it all. But he'll try.
Yeah.
Eugene Scott, thank you so much.
All right, we are